First speaker today is Brantly McCord. He is the Purdue Polytech co-instructor for CGT game dev. He's a TA for others. He's an expert on Unreal Engine 4, and he's also just a wonderful pixel art artist. So I'm going to hand this over to Brantley, and he's going to be talking about be critical, be kind, and something about how to give good constructive feedback in a way that doesn't take people down. So let's add Brantley. There you go, Brantley.
Hello,
and
everybody.
We're going to put your slides up and take it away.
Okay. So, despite being introduced as an Unreal expert, you'll notice this has nothing to do with Unreal. Hey, that's a little bit of, what do you call it? Imposter syndrome, that's what it is. Really, as much as I like making games, I like to teach about making games a lot more. So that's where I'm coming from with this talk. I want to discuss a topic that's close to me and I think close to a lot of my students. So know that as much as I'm coming from this from a game dev perspective, more so I want maybe the humanist side of this to show. So my position as a TA, you'll know my biases coming into this. I hope that allows you to levy my thoughts with your thoughts and come up with something that's valuable to you by the end. So all my contact info is right there if you need it. And if you want to go with these slides at your own pace or see them later, there's a tiny URL link right there. In fact, I'm going to repost it into the Twitch chat just so that way it doesn't get too buried. I tend to go very fast and very slow on my slides. Some slides will be 5 seconds long and others will take minutes on. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. So I feel like this is just the prime time for project ejection. The summertime is when we are wrapping things up. We are attempting to start new projects. Maybe we're quitting something we're just done with. And we get into that like sudden orbital drift. What now? So often, from what I've observed in myself and my students, the immediate kind of question that comes up: how do we improve? Where do I go next? What's the next step for me to, level up my work? It's something that is so surprisingly immediate, despite the fact that we try to scaffold things like, our agile workflows and whatnot into these great big milestones where celebration should be there. But I'm not to talk about that. This question is something that's implicit to our creative passion. So how do we deal with this big question? How do we improve? And why is that always hovering around? I think that even though we won't all consider ourselves critics, at least by term, we do have this inherent sense to be able to know when something we've created is not meeting the execution that we had intended. That we have this vision and there's something not quite there yet. We might not be able to identify what that is. And in the times that we can't, well then, in order to measure that distance, we're going to try to find critics, someone who can point out, what we would hope to be exactly what has been wrong this whole time. We've kind of glorified critique in that sense. That being said, critique hurts sometimes, depending on who you are, maybe a lot of times, maybe not at all. But I think we've gotten to a point, again, from my observations, anecdotally speaking, that even constructive criticism can kind of have like a negative connotation to it, depending on who you're hearing it from, what program you've been in, etc. I'm really not convinced that the right way to go about this, emotional whiplash from critique is to say, well, you'll get used to it. Oh, when you get older, then you just take it easier, or grow a thicker skin. As a bunch of people who normally will talk hours and hours about things like game design, I think it's pretty poor design to just accept something in its state and be complacent with that. If we're talking about how do we improve, I think maybe we can improve critique as well. Gonna be totally honest, it doesn't take a lot for me to sort of bend into this opinion. I'm someone who takes critique hard. I've seen students who are fantastic, utterly great at what they do, top of the charts, and yet will be broken down by critique delivered to them. The polar opposite of me, totally hardcore, and yet I'm watching them go through emotional torture, and it's just not great. So we still want critique, obviously, but we need to get there without getting people hurt. I think that should be a pretty agreeable goal, right? So let's go ahead and leverage a new model, something simple, something that is based in knowledge and context. So I want to get 3 facts straight really quickly. So we're going to talk a little bit of epistemology here. First, prior knowledge matters. We can't know what we don't know. It's impossible. We might think we have novel thoughts, but they're always chained to something that we've already learned. And those learned things are automatically making this mental map. There's, hundreds of different examples of how the brain sort of cognitively structures information. Go take a look sometime if you want. I can give you some examples, but not during this slideshow. Just what's important to know. As we are constructing information from what we are observing or experiencing in the world, we have to bond it to something adjacent. I feel like it's not a surprise that the Wii Remote took off the way it did in retrospect, because so many people already had the existing mental model of how this object should be used. People had gotten used to TV remotes because the buttons are very descriptive in their purpose. The number 1 button makes a number 1 go to the TV to control the channel. And so therefore, when having the Wii Remote, and you have this same shape, the buttons are in thumb range, all one-handed. There's this, barrier of entry that's been pierced because there's something familiar here. You don't quite get that with a gamepad-shaped controller, where, say, the X button can mean any number of things from one game to another. It's not predefined. And so, hey, if you are not to believe the literature on how important prior knowledge is, then I hope you believe in, the market history of game development to look at that. So prior knowledge is important. And as we're creating that knowledge within ourselves, it's being attached not only through prior knowledge, but through meaning as well. Those inherent values we have assigned to things and our own definitions that we've constructed. When someone teaches you something, or when you teach someone something, we're not having some kind of psychic link that just like clones information from one person to another. Basically, they have their set of definitions and you have yours, and based on what they tell you, you have to just do your best to match things together. It's a messy process. That's why education is a difficult thing to go through, and why educators will struggle to find things like, standards to what they're teaching. Because we can't clone information across, if we really want to connect with someone, then you've got to know where their chain links are and where you can hook in. Ultimately, your knowledge can't be my knowledge. And so if we are having a difficulty, discussing, say, what an RPG is, if I want to say Zelda's an RPG because I'm role playing as a character, and I am in a fantasy setting, you might not agree with that. Maybe you think, well, no, RPG is about role playing as, an undefined character, one that I come into and insert through. If we have these classical sensibilities that are tugging away from each other at these extreme ends, and of course, if we get our heads together and say, how do we make the best RPG, we're probably going to start struggling like right out the bat. And so if we can visualize this example, that for the hundreds of times when we decide, is this a Soulsborne game? Is Soulsborne even a genre? If we don't have our meanings aligned, then of course we're not going to have a fruitful discussion. And when we do have things aligned, then we will. Lastly, what is critique? Critique is knowledge that challenges other knowledge. The inception of critique as, like a research format, for example, is all about challenging structures of oppression. essentially, we're challenging norms. Say, hey, this has been this way for a while. Is that still right? Could this be better? Critique is about improvement, and I think that's something we can, look at in a positive light and should. After all, critique is something that is, seemingly not always warranted, but when displayed and communicated insightfully, can get us things we didn't know we ever needed. When I was growing up, I missed the Genesis era of games, but I'd see people in magazines and in person talk about Sonic CD. Oh, awesome game. We need this game back. Port it, please. Just port the thing and leave it alone, because that was the game we liked. And it did get ports, and people liked it, as expected. However, when it came around to bringing it to iOS, the person working on it, Christian Whitehead, right here, actually made some adjustments for the port over, from adjusting things to frame rate, the silky smooth, as well as reconstructing the engine so that way customizing it for his needs and the needs of the game. What he ended up making was actually what fans will consider now, at least from what I've seen, the definitive port of the game. Nobody asked for the iOS version of Sonic CD to become the best version. I think anyone would have been happy to just see it run and be playable. And yet, now we have this surprising gem. And Mr. Whitehead here was a big part of making Sonic Mania happen, a critically acclaimed game. So if you have the power to use critique insightfully and positively, then you can help improve things in a sincere and genuine, legitimate way. Okay, so a quick recap. We organize knowledge meaningfully, and critique is meant to improve the state of knowledge. So if we want to critique, then that means the knowledge of critique and the knowledge we're critiquing should be mutually meaningful. Our descriptions and definitions of things should match if we want to make an impact. In other words, if you're getting critique or if you're receiving critique that doesn't match context, then things aren't going to connect. It's just not going to happen. So my recommendation to you as a critic and to you who seeks critics, be critical, be kind. Now, of course, I just talked about how meaning is important to match, so let's catch up on some definitions. What do I mean here? When I say be critical, I mean be purposeful in how you challenge the meaning and value of what you're seeing. When you want to take a piece of art and then challenge it to become better, then you have to do so with purpose. And you have to be ready to understand where its intent already was and how to elevate that. Be kind. It's not just about being nice. After all, being nice is hard. For any of you who are on social media, So when I say be kind, what I really mean is that you are being sensitive to the person you are discussing with or discoursing with, that you're interacting with their context and their history in order to, interact with them as a person. If you're not being sensitive to those things, then in a way, you're not really being kind. You might be saying what we perceive to be kind things, but again, if there's not that match, then it all kind of falls apart. Now, some more ground rules here. I'm going to make an assumption that the work we create creatively, whether it's art, programming, music design, something in between those, that we're doing so with an intended positive outcome. Sometimes that's, to bring a little light to the world. Sometimes it's to shock people and make money. But there's an intended outcome in there somewhere. And it's meant to be some kind of benefit in a way. So if we can assume that everybody has an intention and that something does get made, there's an execution too. And there's some amount of match or mismatch between these two things, intention and execution. I think that if we maximize kindness and maximize our criticality, that's where we get our most effective push towards execution. If we start to stray away from kindness, for example, or, maybe we're not getting critical. Then we start to sort of angle that line. And so, the same amount of effort being put in is not actually directing us towards a strong execution. And in reverse, if we're pushing criticality, but we're not being kind about it, then again, we're kind of missing the optimum amount of push we can get out of this critique. I want to elaborate a little bit because maybe this seems a little inane. Let's say that we are being very kind, but not critical. We're just giving compliments. And maybe they're even well-directed compliments, but we're not helping with that push to improve, right? If we're not giving feedback and we're only complimenting the work, then the links to what has been done are going to be internalized. If we're not saying, hey, what you did here with your figure sketch is, very well balanced, or I like this asymmetry here, then without those points of feedback, the creator has to take what they've created and attach it to them somehow. They're making that knowledge link, right? And so if they don't have, a skill or a decision to attach to that did the job well, then they just have to take it right back to the root. It becomes a product of them. And so, you're saying, oh, you're doing great. And that's exactly the problem. You become this kind of live nerve where when you have your drawings or your music, you have your code, you have your design drafts, good or bad, those things are tied to you as a person. And that's where I feel like most of the hurt gets dealt. When you can't identify that this, missed execution was a product of a skill or a decision, instead it goes right back to the heart and just stabs right in there. That is unhealthy for both parties. You don't want to lead your receiver into these, malformed connections. We don't want to deal with, that live nerve aspect of it. The more that we are kind without being critical, I think the more that we prime ourselves to get hurt, all of us. And on the flip side of that, again, we're going to extremes here. If you're not sensitive to someone's circumstances and you're just giving opinions on a work, then of course they're not going to land. And you might think, well, I'm not giving opinions. I'm giving, objective insights into how the work can change, or everybody knows this is how it should be. But clearly, if you're not being sensitive to someone's context, where they've been, where they're going next, then that's not really an objective fact to them, potentially. And that's where you might miss out if you don't agree on these base assumptions about what you are applying yourself to. Then, of course, you're not actually taking that hook into a chain that already exists. You're just kind of waving it around. And so the receiver has no choice but to let it go. They hear what you're saying. They see what you're trying to point out, but it's not relevant to them. And so ultimately it falls to the wayside, and whatever hanging question they had ends up being repressed. Well, something's wrong, but they couldn't help me with it. So I'm just going to have to keep thinking about it and, work out this mental discomfort in the meantime. Ultimately, I think if you want to have your best results, have a dialogue. Of course, we're not going to know each other's contexts and situations right away, especially if we're searching for critique from new places. So don't sell yourself short, and don't cut the conversation short either. Whether you are seeking critique or someone has asked you for critique, make sure you get to know each other a little at first, hopefully a lot. Then that enables you to be kind in a way that is effective. It allows you to be critical in a way that is purposeful. Again, if we go out of our way to say, I want critique, to say, I'll take it from everyone, is really not a good use of anybody's time. Even if you've been convinced that that's valuable before, I hope to break that notion that not all critique is good critique. And you can improve critique by getting to know each other first. And yes, this applies to critiquing yourself. because you've got a little voice in your head and you talk to yourself constantly, maybe not even through language, but through symbols and, quick-paced thoughts that just kind of fly by as an emotion or a sense. If you are an independent learner, which, spoilers, you all are in a way, then you've got a dialogue with yourself. You've got to be, of course, critical, but kind too. I think that second one is one that we tend to miss a lot when talking to ourselves. It's very easy to say, well, it's me in my head. I know who I am. So all I have to do is just lay out everything I have to fix. But man, that's not fun. You've got to be able to recall where you're at and where you're going. It's very easy to just layer on critique after critique on yourself without even really understanding where you're at, and therefore just getting so overwhelmed by it all that you just push it all to the side. Say, I'll start again later. And if you start again later without considering your own circumstances again, it's just going to loop around. Be kind to yourself, for goodness sakes, okay? I promise that's going to help you be a more efficient worker. So that is my message to you through the rest of your creative careers, or at the very least for today, as we're seeing our array of speakers and game devs who are taking the opportunity to be brave and display what they've done. Be critical, be kind. I think that's the most optimal way to keep us all creative, no matter where we're going. All right, and with that, I'm all done talking. So I'm going to leave this slide up here for just a moment. Again, if you want to revisit these slides ever, if you're a geek like me and you like to see all these, literary references and where they head, they're there. And additionally, if you want to contact me outside of QA today, or Q&A, sorry, QA is a different thing. Then there's my email, there's my Twitter. I hope that we can have, as I said, a good dialogue. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Brantley. I think this particular time, since I went long on the introduction, we're going to do Q&A here.
Cool.
So I've asked the chat, if you guys have questions for Brantley, please post them in chat. I know it's not as cool as using your human voice, but it'll still work out. I had to dash out for a second, so I'm going to miss a couple of slides here. But one of the things that was interesting is, do you have concrete examples of a point where maybe something went too critical and not enough kind, or too kind and not enough critical? Something that you might be able to obfuscate from in one of your classroom experiences. Sure.
Yeah, I think to cut to the chase on the critical, not kind part, I had to sit down with a student. Absolutely, I would say our best student of that semester that I had exposure to was just extremely hardworking and talented and passionate about what she worked on. We would have discussions about passion, how she might not have seen that in other classmates. Why aren't they as into this as I am? And I did my best to elaborate that people go at their different paces, and everyone has realizations about their work and their own critical process at different times, and we come from different places. At the time, I think the question was still nagging at her. Why are we different like this? And I'm putting in all this work. This seems strange that there's this disconnect here. And then there came a time where she was seeking out critique, as one does. I'm doing great, but I'm not convinced that I'm doing great. I need someone else to confirm where I'm going wrong, because there has to be something. And we're talking about the critique she received, and the longer we're going, she starts to sort of unfold that the critique she got wasn't really relevant to where she wanted to take her character model. The character model itself, in terms of technique, fantastic from what I could see. No holes in that. Instead, the critique was levied against style and sort of the symbology of the character and the iconography of it. And so the more she talked about what she had been told, it was apparent that the critic was trying to make this character have a different message than what the creator wanted. And slowly this evolved into tears because this character was important to the creator. And so there was this desperation, I think, in feeling like, I've worked hard on making this character, and what was wrong with it wasn't my technique. It was what I wanted out of them. And now this character doesn't belong to me anymore. By the end of it, by the end of our discussion, I think we're able to reach the conclusion that, yeah, maybe this critique isn't, particularly applicable to what you want to do. In other words, her intent and the critic's intent were totally different and maybe not communicated, or maybe not listened to in a more dire situation. However, significant damage was caused even when we came to that revelation. By that point, the character wasn't her character anymore. It had become something different through these multiple revisions. And so, the execution, again, was still great. But instead of having this, linearity between the intent and execution, it's now bending over into someone else's territory. And I think that's where things can really do some significant damage. As for, I know I'm running out of time here, so just to flip-flop this, I don't really have a concrete example from experience recently, except my teaching style tends to bend too much towards kind over critical. And the times I elect to do that are times where I don't know when criticality would have a benefit to the student. A student's been, working long nights, will tell me like, yeah, I stayed over at the lab to get this done. What do you think? Well, in a way, it doesn't matter what I think, because there's nothing more the student could have done to improve their work. Those are times where even if I notice, a flaw here or there, it's not relevant to the student to say, well, yeah, you could have spent more time on this, because in a physical way, they couldn't. I have to be careful with that, because as I've described here, if I'm only being kind and not being critical, then yeah, that's not a lot of feedback. But I have to make sure that those links come at an appropriate time. Being a critic is a process that requires a lot of responsibility. So as you're a critic to yourself and a critic to others, sometimes it's good to know when's not appropriate, when to say, sorry, I shouldn't be helping you with this right now. Maybe we can find someone else or another time. And I'm out of time. So I think it's time we move on, okay?